when we think about market structure, 32% of the 7,080 service stations that operate in this country at the moment are what we call company-operated, company-owned, COCOs, for want of a better word. And within that context, that means that the brand that is displayed in the forecourt is also the purchaser of the fuel, the owner or the lessor of the site, and they're the employer of the staff that are working on that site. Then we have another group, which I suppose in a lot of ways you would tend to think of as franchisees. They're not quite, because they don't own the stock in the ground and they don't set the price. These are what we call commission agent operators. And these businesses make up about 16%. They tend to run in some of the bigger networks we know, but it's a franchise model. So effectively, the small business that's operating has control of the shop and the price is there. The big business actually controls the flow of fuel and the price on the forecourt. Now, if you put those two sums together, that's only 48%. So where'd the other 52% come from? Now, 27 of that 52% at last census were actually what we call dodos. So it's not a bird that's selling your Telstra services. It's effectively a dealer-owned, dealer-operated. So the business itself either owns the site, often done through a family trust, or has a lease on the site. And they enter into an arrangement with a major fuel company for the supply of fuel. And often that's a contracted supply arrangement. In return for that, they get the right to display the brand. And they also have some obligations in terms of managing the site, making sure the site looks and feels and reflects the brand accurately. Now, they can change at any point in time. 3 to 5 years is typically the length of time they actually operate, but they work on the basis of being very similar to what a company-owned operation looks like. Now, you add that sum, I've got 25% left. Who are those? Well, they're what we call the independent independents, and they really comprise a bit of a mix of those three models we first talked about. Within that context, we're getting to a situation that these businesses fly a separate brand, and most people typically classify them as being the independents, but they adopt a suite of different models. So I think one of the key things that's often misunderstood is 85% of the price we pay at a retail pump is not related to retail. So around 40% of that, and it goes up and down depending upon where the oil price goes and where refinery costs go, but 40 to 45% of that typically is the wholesale price of the fuel. So that's oil prices, the exchange rate, the production prices that are being charged, and then the transport to our shores. And that's what we build up. It's referred to in our industry as MoGas, because MoGas comes through the Singapore hub, and that's effectively where most of our fuel is actually channeled. That's the market desk in which we actually operate. The remaining 40 to 45% of that first component is actually government taxes, 42.2 cents in every litre. Importantly, and contrary to what some people believe, that price does not go up and down depending upon what the price does. It's indexed by government twice a year, in February and August of each year, and they actually adjust that excise to make sure it's keeping up with the real price of inflation. So within that context, the excise is fairly heavy. And then of course, the government actually collects GST. So if I look at it at that level, that 85% is the cost of the product, producing it, shipping it to Australia, and then the taxes that sit on top of it. The remaining 15%, and once again, this varies depending upon what the price is doing in the price cycle, but it's typically 12 to 15%, is actually the wholesale cost in terms of the transport to the service station, and then the retail cost and the profit. Important to realise it's not all profit. So just like any other business, a service station actually has rent, it has wages, it has electricity, it has all the normal business costs that every retailer actually has, and then it captures that cost through that 15% and takes a margin. Now, pretty typically, the work of the ACCC has actually suggested that our industry, in terms of the profit a service station realises, is somewhere between about 2 and 2.2 cents per litre, averaged over a 12-month period. So it's actually pretty small. You first look at it and say, well, that's extraordinary, it's almost unbelievable. But you've got to remember we're selling a lot of fuel. So we go back to the fact that our costs as a retailer are pretty well similar to similar sized retailers in other industries, and we've got a lot of product that we sell, so we don't need to harvest a lot, and we need to make sure that margin's not too high or we're going to lose volume to someone else. So that tension is where it's been sitting for a long time. So you'll often hear the ACCC and then the subsequent media talk about a thing called a GIRD, G-I-R-D, which is the gross indicative retail difference. Now, to understand what a GIRD means, because it's often interpreted as being profit, and it's actually simply not. The gross indicative retail difference is the difference between the two major benchmarks that our industry reports to the community regularly. That is what we call the terminal gate price. That is, if I was to drive my truck up to a terminal and fill it up with fuel, I'm paying a wholesale price, and then I transport it to wherever I'm actually going. That's what we refer to as a wholesale price. That is reported daily, and it's required by Australian law to be disclosed to the market. Importantly to realise, it's not necessarily the actual buying price, it's a contract benchmark. Depending upon what I'm doing as a big or small fuel retailer, like any industry, I'll actually have some movement in that price, but it's the average benchmark that everyone puts out. The second one we use is the average retail price, which is effectively looking at the price across the country or the price in an individual market. And what I do is I record that average. Like anything though, at any point in time, the fuel retail price in a given market can vary by 10 to 15 cents a litre, excluding the effect of the price cycle. So it's an average. Rarely is anyone paying that average. They're paying below or above it, just like any normal average. So within that context, the GIRD is the subtraction between the average retail price and the average wholesale price. It is not profit, because in looking at that retail price, I've had the build-up of costs. So the same costs that go to running a service station and my profit are the factor in what we call the GIRD. Now, it's because of the nature of the market and the fact that pricing is incredibly complex and we've got all this variability, it is something that the ACCC uses, and it looks at how that varies over time. And what you would expect, if it's stretching, and it's stretching faster than CPI or costs are moving, then you can make an assessment about, are we being taken for a bit of a ride by our fuel retailers? But interestingly, when you look at the history of ACCC reporting for the last 15 years, it's pretty well stayed the same. We're currently tracking at a GIRD of about 15 cents per litre. And it's interesting when you get to high points in time, such as we're seeing at the start of 2022, where we've actually got all sorts of pressures post-pandemic, conflict in Russia and Ukraine that's driving prices higher. Ironically, what tends to happen in the fuel industry is that fuel retailers, trying to keep that price as low as they can, tend to discount their GIRD. The most important thing to remember about GIRD is it's not just the retail costs. I mentioned that it's a benchmark between the price I pay driving my truck up to a refinery, but then I've got to transport it. So it's that cost of transport. If I'm wholesaling that into other markets, it's the wholesale cost that the wholesaler captures. So it's the wholesale, transport and retail costs from refinery to the service station pump. That's the difference. That's what GIRD is. Petrol price cycle is probably one of the things that most annoys motorists in Australia because of the volatility it actually introduces. Unlike global prices, this is a local phenomenon, and it basically occurs when you've got a tension between market participants who are chasing volume versus other market participants who have a fairly significant business and actually stand to lose volume. So within that context, what happens in the petrol price cycle is you actually have service stations who are not looking to make a profit every day. They're looking to keep their volume up and keep the volume on their business high so that their business is worthwhile. And so within that context, the price goes up. I'll discount, the guy next door to me then discounts, I'll match his discount, and you get this game of competitive leapfrog that generally occurs over a 2 or 3 week period. Important to realise that the competition is so fierce that often we'll get the last week of the cycle where I will be selling below the wholesale price, that is the price I'm paying for the fuel. In that context, the market participant that is selling the most fuel goes, well, this is a mug's game because effectively I'm losing more money than my competitor and their price goes up. What happens at that point is everybody else follows it up. Important to realise that modern petrol price cycles in our capital cities don't all go up in a single day, which is a common myth. There's often you'll hear politicians talk about prices shoot up like a rocket and go down like a feather. In most of our capital city markets at the moment, they go up over a 7 to 10 to 12 day period. So generally, if you're a consumer, you can see the change because you get a marked disparity. Petrol prices will start to vary by 35 to 40 cents. That's an indication the price cycle is turning. Jump in and buy the cheaper one you drive past before they all go up to that higher price. So it's important to realise that the petrol price cycles are different in every capital city market. That is, they all don't rise at the same time and fall at the same time, because the market dynamic, the competition dynamic, is actually different in each capital city. And so as a result, the shape will be different. They might go longer, they might go higher, and they might start at different times. The key difference in terms of the major capitals is Perth. Perth has a regulator that actually dictates that I've got to advise my price before I put it in the market for the next day. So by midnight of the night before, I've actually got to make sure that I'm putting my price into the board, and then I have to sell at that price for the next day. What we see in Perth is a sawtooth. So it's actually very predictable. It used to be a 7-day cycle. Over the last 3 months, it's actually moved to a 14-day cycle. Typically goes up on a Tuesday and Wednesday. No real rhyme or reason to that other than it's post-weekend. But what we're actually seeing there is that's a pretty predictable price cycle. It's a bit like a sawtooth, like the blades on a saw. Everybody else, the shapes are wildly different. Now there are the 3 smaller capitals, Darwin, Hobart and Canberra, that don't have sufficient competitive tension to drive a petrol price cycle. And so they operate much like our regional areas in that the cost that's charged in those markets tends to be pretty close. It tends to stay pretty even over time. And generally that's because it's just reflecting the movement that's coming in relation to the wholesale prices. I think one of the big misnomers here is that there seems to be a belief that I'm sitting there as a service station operator actually saying, well, tomorrow I'm going to make sure I need to make this profit and I'll actually take my price to that level. The game at a service station is actually the asset value, and to make sure that my buy cost of fuel is as low as possible. So the key thing for me to do is to make sure my volume stays as high as possible. And often I will actually forego profit to actually make sure that I protect that margin. That's often why in a petrol price cycle you'll actually see some operators will lag. They won't go up straight away because they've had a pretty poor cycle, their volume's dropped a little bit. So what they know is when everybody else goes up, they become a key point of attraction and their volume gets a bit of a burst and then they move up. So within that context, it's important to realise that the game for a service station operator is not about daily profit. It's about a smoothed average. They play a game of 6 to 12 months, making sure they get reasonable profit and they're keeping their volumes up. I suppose the key thing really is service stations really are chasing the retention of customers, making sure people actually come back. The price volatility that we see is a market dynamic rather than an individual operator saying, well, today I'm going to make a profit. I suppose one of the things in the market here is that there's often a suggestion that because we've got 6, 7 big brands, it's actually the 6 or 7 big brands that are getting together in some sort of smoky room in a hotel and working out what their price is going to be going forward. Or, you know, those that I suppose are less conspiratorial, a bit more realistic, are saying, well, they've got a general sense of where everybody's actually going. It's important to remember there are 2,600 independent businesses. So as I mean independent, they're separate businesses that all compete against each other. And those businesses and the retail dynamic is what is actually the price setting mechanism. It's competition above a wholesale price and the retail costs that I actually pass on that actually sets the price in the end. So there's no single person pulling the levers, and this is a point that's often not well understood. It's the competition dynamic that actually operates. When I get to small markets like small regional areas, it's true that it's the single operator. In a lot of small towns, there's only one operator, so it'll be his costs, the costs of the fuel, the costs of the business that are actually then passed through. And so they won't necessarily have that tension. But generally they've got to be careful too, because if they're trying to attract highway traffic and freight traffic, which they will always do to try and survive, then they've actually got to make sure they're competitive as well. So within this context, no one is setting the price in terms of individual call. There are market players that will influence it. So the big guys who are selling a lot of volume, they'll tend to signal when a cycle ends because they're the ones losing the most money when you're selling below cost. But it's never one or other. It depends on the market strength and the composition of the market. When we think about the fuel industry, we need to talk about independence. Now, the real interesting issue in our industry is, what do we mean by independent? Because there's branded independence and there's independent independence, if I can put it that way. So a branded independent is a small business or a mid-sized business which has entered into a marketing arrangement with a big oil company or a big fuel company. So they fly the brand. For all intents and purposes, they look like one of the big company-operated sites. But in the vast majority of cases, it's a small business operating in a branding and marketing relationship. Importantly, they're competing with the company-operated sites. Now, generally no one's silly in these processes, so there is some protection in terms of territory, but they'll be competing with other company-operated sites. And then you've got the independent independents that actually are running a brand that you and I don't recognise as one of the big oil majors or one of the big fuel companies. The problem for these businesses is it's not a known name. It's not like the IBM for computers. And so their market proposition is generally built around price. They're lower than the big guys. And so that means that their mechanism of competing is to consistently be dragging the price down. Now, it's these businesses, if you've got significant numbers in the market, that drive the price cycle. So the big guys put the price up, everybody goes up that level, and it's the independents that drag it down, and they create that tension. And the more of them you have, the broader you're stretching. It's like an elastic band. You've got a lot more independent, then you're pulling the elastic band a long way apart, and it's snapping back. Smaller number of independents, you're not pulling it as far. And so that's typically what actually drives the market. So between city and country, it's really interesting, because if you think about it, the regional price stays fairly average, and so you've got a relatively straight line. It'll jump up as wholesale prices are increasing, it'll come down as wholesale prices are going down, but it's a smooth line. Whereas what we see in capital cities is they might swing between 30 and 35 cents over a 40 or 35-day period. Within that context then, if you compare the capital city price at the top of the cycle, where it's high, with the regional prices, then the capital city looks really expensive. But if you compare it at the bottom of the cycle, then the region looks really expensive. And it's interesting when you actually have a look at that game in terms of the comments we deal with media. You often get criticism of the capital city media when the price cycle is higher, it's higher than regional areas, and people don't understand. And then you get regional media that's actually challenging you when the capital city prices are lower than the regions. But the reality here is most capital cities are quite volatile, whereas the regional areas tend to be fairly even in terms of their pricing. Traditionally, we've always had people say that the reason that regional prices are more expensive is because I have a long supply chain, I've got a distribution cost and I've got to freight that fuel in. It's true to a certain extent, but it's usually fractions of a cent. It's not a huge impost. In some cases, it might be up to a cent. The principal reason that regional locations tend to be a little higher is largely because they're dealing with less volume. The costs of operating a service station, notwithstanding some differences in rent, my wages are the same, my electricity is pretty much the same, my on costs are pretty much the same, my waste costs are pretty much the same, but I'm amortising with a lower fuel volume typically. So a capital city average, 3.5 to 4 million litres a year, a regional average, 2.5, 2.7. So when you're amortising that fuel across similar costs, then you're going to get a higher unit cost in those regional areas. And that's principally why we get variance between regional service stations and metro service stations. Petrol prices going up in public holidays is one of the myths that has been perpetuated in our industry for some time. And I suppose it's reasonable to understand that, because if you think about the way petrol prices are actually made up, it depends upon what's the oil price doing. What's the exchange rate that I'm paying because I'm buying oil in US dollars? What are the refineries doing? What's the relationship between global supply and demand? And what's the shipping and freight costs look like? Now that's all before the fuel lands on my shores. And then beyond that, it's a case of what's the market competition actually look like? What's the petrol price cycle actually doing in terms of volatility? All that creates incredible complexity. And for all of us as human beings, we sort of look at that complexity, and when you've got complexity, people say, oh, it's all too hard, I think it's this, and you boil into these conspiracies. The one good thing in our industry is we're one of only 2 industries in the country, the other one being stevedoring, where the ACCC has powers that have been given to it by the federal government to step into our businesses to be able to look at their finances, what they're paying and what they're charging. Now, for reasons of commercial sensitivity, that is never disclosed in the market, but it means the ACCC is able to monitor what's actually going on. Now, the ACCC, some years ago, looked at this issue of, petrol prices always go up when there's a long weekend or when Christmas or Easter actually occurs. And what they found was really interesting. 1/3 of occasions they go up, supporting the conspiracy. 1/3 of occasions they stay the same. And 1/3 of occasions they actually go down. So it sort of doesn't support that theory that whenever I get a public holiday period, because I've got lots of fuel and people basically are caught to buying fuel, therefore I'm going to actually look at opportunistic pricing. It's also worth noting though that when you look at our behaviours sort of pre-pandemic, everyone used to fly or transport elsewhere. There wasn't that sort of hangover of what we used to do in the 70s and 80s where we all jump in the car and we'd head off down the coast. That sort of behaviour doesn't exist as much anymore. So while we get some seasonality in service stations, it's nowhere near the level we used to get in public holidays when we were actually dealing with the situation sort of 30 years ago. But important to note, the ACCC says on that one, they're calling it, it didn't pass the facts. And so just to reiterate, public holiday times, 1/3 of the times it goes up, 1/3 of the time it stays the same, and 1/3 of the time it goes down. The biggest determinant is, does that public holiday coincide with a capital city price cycle? Because that's the dominant force. We don't have a price cycle that goes up and down and then competition's all of a sudden interrupted because there's a public holiday. That's just nonsensical.